avoided without compromising God's good purposes in the world. The atheist is saying that apparently, there is more evil in the world than there has to be for God to accomplish His good purposes. He could accomplish those purposes just as effectively and yet more happily with less evil in the world. Maybe He couldn't accomplish His purposes with no evil in the world, but certainly He could apparently we say, He could accomplish many of His goals just as well without permitting evil. So why doesn't He do it? Now the question we have in response is, well, now how do you know that? We're not in an especially good position ourselves to make reasonable decisions about how much of the evil in the world really does depend on God's good purposes, and how fully God's purposes could be realized without this much evil in the world. After all, we can think of possible and maybe even actual reasons that God could have for permitting a whole variety of evils in the world. Why should the actual amount of evil make a difference to our account? What about the character of evil then? What about things like the forest fawn? Well, it may be that we can't think of a good reason that God would have for permitting those evils. But should we think that because we can't think of a good reason that God would have for permitting those evils, that He wouldn't have a good reason? But the atheist says, but you're missing the point. Sure, God can know if He has good reasons or not, if He has justifying reasons or not. The point is, we don't know. And because we don't know, we're not justified in believing that God exists. Well, the theodicist might want to say, but we can think of justifying reasons for an awful lot of things. So why should we stumble over a few things that we can't account for, especially when it's God we're talking about? Well, that goes part of the way to responding to the evidential argument from evil. I think what you really have to do is take cases. Take the case of the forest fawn. Why is the forest fawn case so interesting? Why does William Rowe take the case of a forest fawn and not a philosophy professor at a university like Biola University? Gets trapped in the woods. There's a blazing fire. He's running for his life. He falls and breaks his leg. He can't get away soon enough, and he suffocates from smoke inhalation. Why isn't that his example?
Because the fawn is totally innocent.
The fawn is completely innocent. That's certainly part of the story. What else?
God could use your death to bring your family to Him.
There are all sorts of possibilities. Probably, chances are, if that happens to me, it's going to be discovered. All right? This could make a difference in the life of somebody else. This could pave the way to salvation for somebody. This could cause the family to come together in certain ways and to grow in virtue and character in certain ways. It may present the occasion for that, but not the guarantee of that. And these might be justifying reasons. Or it might even be that as I lie there in the woods contemplating my soon demise, something good takes place in my own soul in preparation for an afterlife or something. Now, I like to emphasize, when I talk about animal pain in these cases, I like to emphasize the important difference that Rowe thinks exists between humans and animals when it comes to pain and suffering. But notice, one reason why there's this difference is because animals and humans have a different consciousness. They make sense of their experiences in different ways. We act for purposes and goals and in intentional ways when animals often act instinctively. And so we think there's a difference in consciousness between those kinds of animals and ourselves. Now, that's part of what constitutes the difference between the human and the animal placed in similar circumstances, and the reason why he wants to put the animal in those circumstances. But if you press that difference very far, you run up against how little we actually know about animal consciousness and pain, and the assimilation of pain experiences and pain stimuli in consciousness on the part of an animal. And if it should turn out that the animal does not really suffer in the way that you and I imagine we would if it was us in that situation, because it's an animal of a completely different kind, then the problem begins to lose its punch. Do you see that? So one of the responses to the evidential argument from evil is that you've got to take cases. And certainly if the atheist wants to say some kinds of evil are especially problematic for belief in God, then he's got to have certain kinds in mind, and you're entitled to ask him, well, now just what evils would you say are problematic in this sense? And then you examine the cases, like we just did. Now, that's one type of response, to offer some sort of a theodicy. Now, to my mind, this is effective, and it's especially effective if you can say, these are the actual reasons God has for permitting those sorts of evils, or for permitting that much evil. Right? And not only that, but we can see that those reasons morally justify God's permission of evil. But you know what? We can't say that about very many of these things. It's very hard to make a convincing case that this degree of evil and these kinds of evils have precisely these specifiable, actual, morally justifying reasons, so that there's nothing left over, nothing dangling. So there's not just a little bit of evil we haven't accounted for, or some peculiar kind of evil we haven't accounted for. And that's why I have reservations about relying exclusively on this methodology. So what else do we say? We also need to take into consideration the positive evidence for the existence of God. The positive evidence for the existence of God. A God who is powerful enough to be judged all-powerful, and wise enough to be judged omniscient, and good enough to be considered morally perfect. One of the reasons why I titled my book on evil, Evil and the Evidence for God, is because in my judgment, one of the greatest, most effective responses to the evidential argument from evil is to present evidence for the existence of God that outweighs the evidence from evil. And when you do that, you're not presenting a theodicy. You're not giving an account of the possible or actual reasons God has for permitting evil that justify His permission of evil. What you're doing is you're giving somebody good reasons to believe that God exists, and therefore good reasons to believe that God does have morally justifying reasons, even if you can't begin to understand what those reasons are. Okay? So if you have confidence that God exists, you don't need to have confidence that you know what particular good is served by every particular evil that happens. Because you've got enough evidence to believe that some good is served by His permission of every evil without knowing what it is, because you know He's good. You know He's powerful. Now, this means that you need to invite other lecturers to come into your class and present arguments for the existence of God. Arguments that reinforce the conviction that God is not just the creator of the origin of the universe, but that He created it for good purposes, and that He looks after His universe, and that He has certain goods for which He acted in producing this universe. This is why I think that the most appealing, fascinating version of the design argument for the existence of God is an argument based on cosmic constants, those things that establish the physical conditions of our universe in such an apparently finely tuned fashion that if you just took one and altered it ever so slightly in any particular direction, you wouldn't get the universe that we have. In particular, you wouldn't get a universe inhabited with human beings.